chronic physiological or psychological need for a habit-forming substance, behavior, or activity having harmful physical, psychological, or social effects and typically causing well-defined symptoms, such as anxiety, irritability, tremors, or nausea upon withdrawal or abstinence. So research has demonstrated that addiction is a disease that chemically changes the brain, essentially turning a person into a slave to a substance or activity. So we start to see how these things begin to tie together from the original origins of the word to the modern definition. So in addition to the modern definition and the origins of the word, there's the story of Addictus. The Latin definition gets support from the ancient myth of Addictus. The myth tells the story of a slave who was set free from his master, but became so used to his chains that he wandered the land with his chains still attached, even though he could have removed them at any time. This story, of course, can be seen as a metaphor for the modern definition of addiction as we know it today. Because an addict becomes tolerant to the drugs they use, they become a slave that doesn't recognize their own freedom. So I thought it was really interesting because a lot of what we're going to talk about is how the brain actually becomes sort of enslaved to the addiction and the substances. So with that, Kristin, are you with us?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Nice. I can. Just let me know if you need help changing slides.
Okay, will do. Hi, everybody. So now we're going to segue into just doing a brief, quick overview of the brain and the areas of the brain that are affected by addiction. So we're going to be looking at the limbic system, which is the amygdala, the hippocampus, and a little area called the nucleus accumbens. And we'll also be talking briefly about the prefrontal cortex. Okay, Paul, can you give me a new slide? So we're going to start with talking about the reward center, which is within the limbic system. So the areas there that are affected the most by substance use are the nucleus accumbens, the amygdala, and the hippocampus. So if you look over to the picture of the brain, you can see the nucleus accumbens right there in the middle of the brain. It's about the size of a pea. The hippocampus, it's sort of like the shape of a horn, and at the end is the amygdala. So the nucleus accumbens, that's the area. It gets flooded with a neurotransmitter called dopamine. And dopamine is a neurotransmitter that makes us feel really good. And when you do something that's pleasurable, like, spending time with your family, going bowling, that's the area that gets flooded by dopamine. Now, when you used a substance, that also gets flooded with dopamine. Then you move down to the hippocampus, which is responsible for memory. And we're going to go over this. Nope, go back, Paul. Not ready yet. Can you go? Thank you. So then we're going to go to the hippocampus, which is responsible for memory. And this is the area that learns. It's responsible for memory, and it learns that the drug provides a quick sense of satisfaction. So the nucleus accumbens gets flooded with dopamine. Then the hippocampus learns that that happens when you take a drug. And then the amygdala, which is responsible for emotion, links that pleasant feeling to the memory. So this is all happening, and this is a big reason. This is the reward center that Paul's going to go into way more depth. We just wanted to give you a brief overview of what it looks like in the structures that he'll be going over in more detail. Now we can go, Paul, forward one. So now we need to just define with the prefrontal cortex, which is the other area that's significantly affected by drug use. So it's the last area of the human brain to develop. So the structures we were referring to earlier, they developed much earlier than the cortex. So those are more subconscious things that are happening. You don't actually have to think about them. They just happen without thought. The cortex is the outside area of the brain. If you look on that little picture down there, it's that squiggly area. And it's not fully developed until we're in our mid to late 20s without it, and it's responsible. It's like the master control of the brain. And the reason why I wanted to just note that it's not fully developed in teens is because of teen drug use. So this is a reason why it's even more difficult for teens, or more dangerous for teens to use drugs. So this area is responsible for all your complex thought, and it is not directly connected to the reward center that we were talking about earlier. So the complex thought happens in the cortex. So all those other things are happening subconsciously, disconnected from the cortex. So it's all subconscious. The person has no idea that that's going on. They can't think about it, which is really important when you're talking about how to treat substance use and addiction. Okay, now Paul is going to go into the reward system in more detail.
Thank you, Kristin.
You're welcome.
Sorry about that jump ahead with the slides there.
No worries, we're good, all good.
So let's talk about the reward system and our friend SpongeBob. Kristin was talking about the limbic system. A reference to this meme here, the reason why you remember every embarrassing thing you ever did and not what you learned in math class. That is definitely me. So the reward system, it's a complex structure in the brain responsible for a variety of functions, such as thirst, hunger, sleep, sex, motivation, and the reward of behaviors deemed successful. In addition, it also helps in the regulation of emotions and their attachment to memories. It is part of the limbic system. So as Kristin was referencing, that's sort of a more subconscious system. And most of the operations it manages, such as those described above, are not conscious or under our control. I thought it was interesting to note that all mammals and even non-mammals have similar brain structures. It feels good. And the reward system when you finally beat Candy Crush. The brain responds to the stimulation of natural rewards, such as food and water. We all have a response to those things. It lets us know what feels good, alleviates a basic need, and encourages us to repeat the same behaviors to meet those same needs over and over again. If something doesn't feel good, we're not likely to do it again based on our limbic system. So the reward system and addiction, let's talk about them sort of in combination. In active addiction, a person engages in repeated behaviors that have turned compulsive. So in the beginning, these behaviors might be more impulsive, particularly in early years. And then impulse tends to turn to compulse. The behaviors are reinforced in the limbic system where they feel good or they alleviate feelings that don't feel good. This leads to the loss of control and limiting the behavior in spite of any consequences or damage the person suffers as a result of the behavior, such as our friend Homer Simpson here continuing to eat donuts in spite of any damage that he has suffered from eating too many donuts. I certainly can relate to Homer in that regard. The reward system cannot use words to communicate with the rest of the brain. It uses feelings and emotions. And that has to do somewhat with it being subconscious. Feelings like hunger, craving, pain, and fear are the ways it tries to influence us to satisfy it. It will send a craving for the drug or the gambling or the donuts or whatever to the frontal lobes of the brain, our center for planning and judgment. It uses the only language that it has, which is feelings. This is why addicts may have trouble finding words to describe what they are going through. The reward system has been rewired. So we're going to talk now about the 3 stages of addiction, and just another note quickly, I guess, back on this slide here about the reward system being rewired and it working off of feelings and emotions. We'll talk certainly more towards the end of this webinar about ways that we can more effectively communicate with our loved ones. But I think it's important to note, and this has been noted even back in the 1930s when they created the Alcoholics Anonymous text, that talking to people who are suffering from substance use disorder often has to have a feeling or emotional appeal to it because of the language that they're speaking. So we're now going to talk, now that we have a basic understanding of the reward system and sort of what happens, right, that rewards are basically the brain being reinforced, is that we're going to talk about something called the 3 stages of addiction that occur in the brain. And we have a little diagram here that will help us kind of see what areas these are happening in, going back to some of the stuff that Kristin talked about. Well-supported evidence suggests that the addiction process involves a 3-stage cycle. The first stage is binge and intoxication, and I will talk more about each stage more in depth and how we define those stages. The second stage is withdrawal or negative affect, and the third stage is preoccupation or anticipation. This cycle becomes more severe as a person continues substance use and as it produces dramatic changes in brain function that reduce a person's ability to control his or her substance use. In that sense, we can talk about addiction as being progressive and that it gets worse, not better over time, and this is one of the reasons why. This is just a further picture to sort of demonstrate these 3 stages and where they're happening in the brain. There's a little bit more information here, some of which I'm going to skip over, such as the neuroadaptations. But I think we begin to kind of get a picture of the 3 different stages and how they're occurring. The first being binge and intoxication, which includes feeling euphoric, feeling good, or escaping dysphoria, which is another way of saying bad feelings. Into the next phase of withdrawal and negative affect, where there's reduced energy, feeling reduced excitement, feeling depressed, anxious, restless, stressed out, all of the above. Leading into the preoccupation and anticipation of looking forward, desiring a drug and obsessing and planning to get the drug to try to alleviate the feelings from the previous stage and to once again achieve the feelings of the first stage. So a little bit of a tangent here, because as we talk about the definitions of those stages, we're going to reference a very famous psychological experiment that was done by Ivan Pavlov, and it's called Pavlov's dogs. And the basic summary of this experiment was, as you can see here in the first box, before any conditioning happens, an unconditioned stimulus, such as food, creates an unconditioned response, such as salivation. So the dog sees the food, the dog salivates. Also before conditioning, a neutral stimulus, such as a bell, creates no conditioned response. Dog doesn't have any recognition. You could ring the bell, will not create any salivation. This experiment found that during conditioning, if you combine the combination of the bell with the food, the dog would have the unconditioned response of salivation. And then after the conditioning is done, you could present the dog with the bell and the sound of the bell. Without the food, the dog would have the conditioned response of salivating. So what does that have to do with addiction and with the 3 stages? So stage 1, again, binge and intoxication. This stage is very similar to what happened with Pavlov's dogs. When a person takes an addictive drug, a surge of dopamine, which is a chemical that brings about pleasant feelings, is released, and the brain's receptors register it as a reward. So with continued use, the brain's dopamine cells start firing in anticipation of receiving the drug. The brain has learned to associate the reward with the environmental stimuli at the time, and that means all the cues of drug use. So where you are, who you were with, how you were feeling, the smell and look of the drug, these can all trigger powerful cravings and prompt a binge. So think somebody drives by their favorite liquor store. That's exactly what's happening here. That conditioned response can happen. Driving by a liquor store can create someone to feel thirsty and think, I should probably stop and pick up some vodka. It's why hanging around those that you did drugs with or walking past your favorite bar can be so dangerous. The conditioning becomes so ingrained that even in a person with years of successful recovery, cues can arise to trigger drug-seeking behavior. So then we go to stage 2, withdrawal and negative affect. As drug use continues, a disturbing thing happens. The brain adapts by resetting its reward system, dulling the ability of the person to experience pleasure from the drug or from the other things in life that used to motivate them, such as relationships and activities. So somebody who may have gotten pleasure from running no longer is able to get pleasure from running because their brain is now used to this big spike that it gets from alcohol. Not only that, drug use causes changes in brain circuitry that set in motion an overactive anti-reward system, boosting the person's reactivity to stress and prompting negative feelings when the drug is withdrawn. Eventually, the person is no longer using the drug to get high, but to simply stave off cravings and the pain of withdrawal. It sets up a vicious cycle. The more the drug is used, the worse the cravings and withdrawal will be, which pushes the person to use more of the drug and into the third stage of preoccupation and anticipation. As the addiction progresses, the person becomes more and more obsessed with their drug, even though their world may be crashing down around them and even though they may be desperate to stop. The problem is, addiction not only affects reward circuits, it messes up signaling in the parts of the brain involved in executive functions, such as self-regulation, decision-making, and the ability to monitor error, which Kristin was referencing earlier, talking about the prefrontal cortex. Without these to rely upon, the desire to stop often becomes no match for the desire to use. And the person then becomes stuck and engaged in this endless cycle. I often think of this stage as the brain becoming obsessed and the obsession of the mind, which leads to the physical compulsion of use. So now we're going to talk a little bit more about specific drugs in the brain. This is one of those topics that could be covered for a long time. We're going to just briefly kind of go over this. I'll share one video and then let Kristin talk a little bit more. This is some basic vocabulary for us to understand how the different drugs will affect the brain. Neurons and neurotransmitters. A neuron is a cell that receives information and transmits it to other cells in our brain, and this is a picture of what it looks like. And the neurotransmitter is the chemical messenger that carries the signal between neurons, as well as other cells in the body. These chemicals are released from the end of one neuron and across the synapse, which is also just the gap. It's the space in between that to a receptor site and the other neuron. So, how drugs affect your brain? Drugs interfere with the way that those neurons send and receive and process signals via those neurotransmitters. So some drugs such as marijuana and heroin can activate neurons because their chemical structure mimics that of a natural neurotransmitter in the body. This allows the drugs to attach onto and activate the neurons. Although these drugs mimic the brain's own chemicals, they don't activate neurons in the same way as a natural neurotransmitter. We talked about this a little bit earlier in the reward system, and they lead to an abnormal message being sent through the network. So here, I'm going to share one quick video. I'm actually going to skip, due to time, I'm going to skip that particular video, and we're going to watch this video. It's a very short video. It's going to explain in more detail about, this is on alcohol.
Inhibitory neurotransmitters called.
All right, so I'm being told that that's not working. So what we're going to do is I'm going to just switch back to the webinar. Bear with me just 1 second here. All right, so let me just double check. Can somebody verify for me that you can now see the share of the screen?
I can see the share of the screen, Paul. Can you hear me, Paul? Can you hear me, Paul? Okay, so it seems
Kristin?
like, yep, can you hear me, Paul? I couldn't tell if I was frozen or you were frozen. Okay, so it seems like everybody can hear me. Are you there, Paul?
All right, let's try this again.
Okay, Paul's back.
Okay, so I have my, we're back. Sorry about that. I think I was disconnected from the internet for a minute. So now this is where Kristin can jump in. Kristin, are you?
I'm here. Yep. Oh, we're in the wrong one, Paul. Do you want me to share my screen? Okay, I'm gonna share my screen, Paul.
Able to see anything, Kristin?
Yeah, you're in the wrong one though. I'm gonna share my screen. Okay. Okay. Can everybody see me now? See my screen? Okay. Sorry about that, you guys. We're having some technical difficulties. Okay, so now we're going to segue back to seeing what this looks like in the brain. So the nucleus accumbens that we had identified early, which you can see on the screen, it's about the size of a pea. As we had discussed, it's flooded with dopamine. And just so we're aware of the difference in how addictive substances work in the brain, they can release about 2 to 10 times the amount that natural rewards do. So Paul was using the example of a donut, right? So a donut's gonna exhibit just a certain amount of reward, which for me is a pretty big reward because I like donuts. Whereas if I were to drink alcohol or take another drug, I would get 10 times the amount of that flooded into the nucleus accumbens. So now what happens is your brain is constantly, your whole body actually is constantly trying to stay in homeostasis. So the brain recognizes that there's way too much dopamine in there. So it adapts by producing less dopamine. And this can happen, if you recall back in a couple slides earlier that Paul had, you saw that synapse. It can happen by producing less firing of those neurons. So they'll actually slow down and the neuron won't fire as much. And it can also do it by blocking the amount that is released. So it happens in a couple of different ways. But the outcome is that there is now going to be less dopamine produced naturally by the brain. And we also want to remember that in nature, rewards usually come only with time and effort. So it takes time and we have to work towards them. However, addictive drugs and behaviors provide a shortcut. So it's a shortcut right to that dopamine, right to that feel-good feeling. And they flood the brain with dopamine. And there's some other neurotransmitters involved too, but we're not going to get into those today. And our brains, they don't have an easy way to withstand that, right? So they're going to have to work towards fixing that. So because of this, right, the substance, which in the beginning caused this giant flood of dopamine, this giant feeling of euphoria, the substance no longer creates that effect, that incredible feeling, which Paul had talked about earlier when he was referencing the reward system, right? All of a sudden it stops working and they're still chasing that huge dopamine release, that great feeling that they had in the beginning, because the hippocampus remembers that feeling along with the amygdala. They work together to remember that feeling. So you're trying to chase it, even though it's no longer creating the same effect. Okay, so this is when you see people continuing to use in that preoccupied place, even though they'll tell you that they don't feel the same way that they used to when they use. So when your loved ones are saying that, they really mean it and it's true, and there's a biological basis for that. So what does all this mean? If we put this all together, what does this look like in life? Okay, the brain is now wired to chase a substance that once made him or her feel immediate and total satisfaction, despite the fact it no longer does. This is all subconscious. People don't even consciously know this is happening. The brain is just driving them to do these things and chase these things and these cravings and all of that without that master control being fully involved. So they're not even fully aware that this is what's happening. It's like the brain gets hijacked. And the last one is they're no longer happy when they use, but they're also not happy when they're sober, okay? And this is an incredibly important thing, because when we talk about somebody that wants recovery, right, this is generally the place that people have to get to before they're even gonna acknowledge that they want recovery. And I like to think of it as a scale where one side is sobriety and one side is active use, right? And what has happened up until this point is that scale has been tipped in the favor of active use. They're getting that reward. The reward system is working. They're feeling great off of the drug. Now, all of a sudden, the scale is getting closer to being equal because they're no longer feeling that euphoria anymore. But we also have to acknowledge the fact that sobriety is incredibly painful as well. So when they're sober, now they have even less dopamine, right? Because the dopaminergic system is no longer producing dopamine naturally. So not only do they have to deal with the incredibly painful side of withdrawal, the physical withdrawal, which, by the way, is the easier part of sobriety, but they also now have to deal with this feeling of a complete lack of pleasure. And what we call this is anhedonia, the loss of interest and enjoyment in all activities that you once liked, the feeling of not caring anymore. So at this point, if you think of that scale, people are feeling it both with active use and with sobriety. They find no pleasure in either. And then on top of it, you have that hippocampus and amygdala that remember that feeling and want to chase it, that feeling that they had in the beginning. So they're kind of left in this state of, I'm not sure what to do, right? So, and by the way, I also want to mention that anhedonia is also, you know, people have experienced this with depression. So it can be created by substance use, but it also can happen naturally. So I just also wanted to show you what this looks like in the brain. So the chemical composition of dopamine is up there on the screen. You can see it. If you look below, you'll see what happens in the brain. So that middle of the brain that's yellow in all three slides, the first one, you see that red. That's the dopamine, okay? Those are the dopamine receptors lit up. And then after 1 month of cocaine, and then after 4 months of cocaine use. So you can see it no longer lights up like it did in the first slide. So now what do we do with this, right? Where do we go with this? Since they're no longer feeling good when they're using, but they don't feel good sober, there's no easy answer here, right? So one of the things that we have to make sure that we're doing is, if they're still using, we have to make sure that they're feeling all of the natural consequences of that active use, right? So that pain scale starts to tip in favor of recovery. Because when active use becomes more painful than recovery, and let's remember at this point, the scale's pretty much even. They're both, neither one is really giving them a great feeling of euphoria or happiness or anything, right? So we have to make sure that we allow all of the natural consequences to help tip that scale in favor of recovery. And I think once, and I know once people choose recovery, one of the questions that is asked more often than not is, can the brain heal? Is this forever? And our loved ones at that, or us at that moment, feel like it's forever, because now you're not using and you feel awful. You have very little dopamine in the brain at this point. So even activities that should make you feel good don't. And it's what we would refer to as depression. And in the beginning stages of recovery, it can be very, very pronounced. So can the brain heal? The answer to that is absolutely. It absolutely can heal. We call this brain plasticity. And what that means is, can the brain regenerate itself after there's a significant change or loss of functioning? And long time ago, years ago, scientists did not believe that an adult brain could heal. And I'm sure a lot of people still hear this and still believe this, that once your brain is fully developed, that's it, that's all you got. But that's actually not true. Studies now are proving that the brain can heal even in adulthood. It has a fair amount of plasticity left. I mean, the good news is for teens, there's still a ton of plasticity. For adults, it's a little bit less, but it can heal. Now, that's the good news. The bad news is that for dopamine receptors to regenerate, it's going to take about 6 to 12 months. So the first year of recovery is incredibly challenging, because biologically now their brain is wired to not feel joy or happiness doing activities that would once have made them happy or would make a typical brain feel joy, have more dopamine released. So what does that mean? That means that we have to be aware going forward when it comes to addiction and it comes to recovery, that the first year is challenging and it will most likely take quite some time for the person to be able to develop the ability to stay sober without some sort of external controls and assistance and help. Okay, oftentimes people need a lot of structure in the first year, and this is why. Hopefully our system is going to move in the direction where we start to offer more time for people, because if we could offer 6 months to a year of treatment, that would be awesome. Now that we know the biology, you can see how helpful that would be, because that brain, that hippocampus and amygdala still remember that feeling of the initial euphoria. So now you have significantly less euphoria, right? Because the brain can't even create the same amount of dopamine it did prior to the beginning of use. And it's driving them back to use. So this is why people relapse quite frequently in the first year. So what do we do? What can we do to give people the best form of treatment, the best way to help get through that first year? So some of the treatments for anhedonia, and I'm sure you've heard of a lot of these. And by the way, these are the same exact treatments that we would offer somebody who was dealing with a significant depression. So antidepressants, psychotherapy, yoga, physical activity. On the physical activity, I want to also note that physical activity produces endorphins, which also affect the brain, and that's the body's natural antidepressant. So physical activity can be very beneficial to people in the first year of recovery and going forward, and can really be beneficial to all of us. But the physical activity in the first year of recovery is incredibly helpful. We need to make sure that people are getting regular sleep, because that's going to give us the best defense in getting through some of the tough days. Goal setting and having hope that lives can be turned around, because let's remember, the first year of recovery, there's typically also a lot of cleanup that needs to be done. Finances are usually a mess. Family members and relationships are usually a mess. There's a lot of amends that has to take place. So that can be very difficult. Dietary improvements. Diet affects mental health significantly. We know this now. So we really need to make sure that we're trying to eat. And it's a hard time too for people to try to change their diet. So we don't want to put too much pressure on them either, but it can be very, very beneficial to treating the anhedonia. And I want to make sure that I mention one of the most important pieces of the first year of recovery and on is human connectedness. Lots of studies are coming out proving that human connectedness is a key element to people reaching long-term recovery, to fighting addiction, to that creating those connections again and the dopamine releases. Some even suggest that the opposite of active addiction is human connectedness. So on the slide, I have AA and NA. This is why the 12 steps are one of the reasons. There's many reasons why 12 steps are important for people, but one of the main ones is the human connectedness that they get, and the understanding and the non-judgmental place for them to go. And I think another piece that's incredibly important to mention is the hope that these meetings can provide when you can see people, and they can see people who have come out of that first year and who are feeling better again and who are experiencing joy in life from things that don't require substances. So that concludes the slideshow for today. I just want to touch base on a couple of things we offer here at the Herren Project that you might find helpful. We offer family support services. for individuals whose loved ones are struggling with substance use disorder and any sort of active use. And our main part of the family support services are the virtual online support groups. They're all moderated by licensed clinicians. They're all virtual, as mentioned earlier, so you can join them all right from your computer, device, smartphone, and any device. They're all free. And you can find all the information on them right up on our website, which is herrenproject.org. And we do offer a spousal support meeting weekly, multiple family support meetings weekly, a grief support group. Actually, there's going to be 2. We're adding another one, and 2 parental supports. And we also offer 15-minute phone consultations with licensed clinicians. You can sign up for those right on our website as well. Paul and I are the 2 that are doing them currently, so you can choose between each of us, and those are free as well. And what do we do here? We're actually much bigger than just what we offer for treatment and recovery services. Obviously, that's one of the boxes, our family support services. If you have a loved one that's struggling, or you yourself are struggling, you can reach out to our recovery specialists. And all the information on how to do that is at herrenproject.org as well. And our final slide today gives the phone number and the email address and both Paul and I's contact information as well. We offer prevention and wellness in our Herren Project clubs. You can get all that information right up on the website as well. That is a program that we're offering for students in school systems. And then, of course, our Team Herren Project, which is how we raise funds. So if there's any runners out there who enjoyed this today, or people who like to stay active, even if you don't run and you just walk, would love to have you as a part of our team. And all information on that is on our website as well. Here's our treatment team. These are the people that you'll be talking to and working with. If you join a support group or you schedule a session, there's Paul and I right there, our wonderful headshots. And there's the contact information. So you can reach Paul and I on our email addresses. If you have any questions specific for us, feel free to reach out. The email address for the recovery team is right there, recovery@herrenproject.org. The phone number to call if you have a loved one that's struggling, they can call that number and our team will help them. And there's our family support resource website. We're actually going to be having a new website coming out soon too, so stay tuned for that. So that's it. I'm going to stop sharing my screen right now. Paul, you want to turn on your video? So here we are, you guys. Paul and I. We do have a couple questions. We have a few minutes, so if we can answer, if anybody has any questions, quick ones, not real in-depth ones, we might be able to take 1 or 2. Lots of thank yous. Awesome.
Thank you, everyone who joined. Thank you, Kristin.
Yep. We're so glad you guys came.
Bearing with us.
Sorry for the technical difficulties. So yes, somebody asked a question if there will be a link to this. Within a day or 2, you will receive a link to a recording of this webinar if you want to watch it again. And within a few days, it will also be up on our YouTube site. We have a YouTube channel, and all of our webinars are up there. So you can find this one as well as the other ones that we've done in the past. And Paul and I were talking about trying to do a part 2 to this stuff. I mean, how many hours could we put towards this, Paul?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's literally semesters are taught on this subject alone. So
right.
And yes, we can send the slides around as well.
Yep.
Oh, and the video that wouldn't work, I will share that site. It was I'll just share it briefly verbally. It's something, if you Google Mouse Party, it's a website that was done by a university, and they have all these different videos. They're done by a cartoon. They break it down into really easy to understand, and they have it on all the different substances. I was just going to share a few today, but if you're curious about a specific substance, I definitely encourage Googling Mouse Party. They're on YouTube, but they also have a website if you have a Flash player that you want to try to use in conjunction. You can watch all the videos on the original website that was done through the university.
Okay, couple of really quick questions. We'll try to get to some of them. What has research found about reasons why people relapse after a year? That reward pathway has been ingrained. So it doesn't just go away after a year. The dopamine levels restore, but that memory with the amygdala and the hippocampus, that's still there. So there's still the cravings, especially when the pain comes. When the pain comes, the brain remembers the relief that it got from the drug. So it's not like it's just a flip of a switch after a year and it all goes away. Do you have anything to add to that, Paul?
No, we touched a little bit about that too, in that 3-stage cycle in terms of how cues can still trigger somebody with years and years of recovery. It's not just cues that, there's so much that can lead to relapse after a year. So it could be stressors, it could be isolation. I mean, those are two very common things, I think, that begin the process of someone turning back to old.
Yep. If a person starts drinking at age 16, does their maturity level stay at age 16? It's very difficult to learn when you're using drugs, and emotional maturity, a lot of that happens via learning. So will the person still mature? Yes, but it will not be to the same degree as somebody who is not using drugs. Anything, Paul, to add to that?
That's another thing that we could talk about. We could do a whole webinar on emotional development. I think an important note that they found is that emotional integration doesn't occur. Kristin talked about prefrontal cortex development not happening until 25, and they found that emotional integration doesn't happen until the 30s for a lot of people, especially with substance use disorder.
Mm-hmm. How do you help when they're at that point but won't stop? Step back and wait. Yeah, I think the best way that I have to explain it is that pain scale that I was talking about earlier. And the best thing that we can do is not protect them from the natural consequences that adds to the pain of active use. So oftentimes what we do is step in and want to remove, like we get lawyers to keep them from going to jail and things like that. And we want to allow those natural consequences to take hold, because we want the scale to tip in favor of sobriety. So we want to we don't want to add in terms of like being angry and punishing, but we want to allow all the natural consequences to add to that side of the scale of active use. So it'll eventually tip in the favor of sobriety. That's a quick and easy answer. Of course, I could go on for days on that one. Actually, just so you know, Lori, there is a boundaries and codependency webinar that I've done in the past that you can get on our YouTube channel that answers a lot of those questions. And I have a son who refuses to attend NA or NA meetings, won't see a therapist. Any recommendations? Same thing that I just said. Best thing for you to do is to circle over to our YouTube channel and check out the boundaries and codependency webinar there. That one can answer a lot of those questions for you. So I'm so glad all of you were able to join us today. You have anything you want to say, Paul?
I think we missed a question.
Okay.
Someone talked about asking a question about responding on an emotional level to those addicted. And again, that's something that, you could learn a lot about, certainly by attending the boundaries seminar, because I think as particularly if you're a parent or even a husband or a wife, a significant other, it's important to have those boundaries established. But also when talking to a loved one, loved ones know when the agenda is there, and they know when someone's coming from a genuine perspective. And I've just found that most of the healthy discussions, the productive discussions, happen when we also become vulnerable, talking to a loved one in particular. And one other note on that is, and this is very brief because we could do a seminar on this too, is the rational mind and the emotional mind. And if you talk to a person who's in an emotional mind from a rational mind, you're not likely to be understood or heard. That doesn't mean, yelling and screaming with somebody, but it means having some emotion behind what you say. And the last thing I'll say that I say a lot to families too is that, and this pertains to the last couple of questions, I think oftentimes as loved ones, you're in the results business, you're not in the results business, you're in the message delivery business. And so continuing to deliver the message for the person that doesn't want to go to AA or NA or won't see a therapist, continuing to encourage that while setting your own boundaries is important as well.
Yep. Agreed. We have one more question. This will be the last one we're able to take. How do you know when they are ready to come home from jail, when they say they will change and they are 24? I don't think you're ever going to know anything, especially something that's in somebody else's control. And that's one of the hardest part for us, I think, to come to terms with, is the fact that we don't have control over what they do or say or their choices. We only have control over how we respond to them. So I think you got to ask yourself if it works for you to have your 24-year-old in your home. And if the answer to that is no, then they shouldn't be coming home. So are you ready to have him or her home? And have they proven to you that they can manage being home? And if not, what do you need to see? So instead of it being if they're ready, you have to ask yourself more questions about you and where your comfort level is. And the reality is my answer to that is, if he or she is 24, probably better off not coming home. It doesn't really lead to a ton of self-esteem when people are living in their parents' house. And unless it's 100% financially necessary, because there's really nothing else, and even then sometimes it's still not the best idea. But a recovery residence, sober house, something like that is a much better place for them to be, starting their life, figuring out how to support themselves. That all leads to more self-esteem, which it actually aids in recovery. So that's all I got. You got anything else, Paul?
No, thank you everyone for joining us today. Kristin and Kevin, thank you both.
Yep, thank you everybody. So keep your eyes out for more to come.
All right, everybody stay safe out there. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.